why don't we jump right in? If you have any questions, just stop me at any point. But I'm going to dive right into this because we don't have too much time tonight. Let's see here. Okay. There are a couple of things I want to revisit. I want to revisit the 5 competitive forces tonight. I want to revisit the SWOT analysis tonight. I want to revisit the strategic group mapping tonight. Those are some of the most important concepts in the course, and they're concepts that will come up again and again, particularly the SWOT analysis and the 5 forces analysis. So I want to spend probably the vast majority of our time this evening on those 2 things. So once again, the 5 competitive forces are an analysis of a company's competitive strength with respect to barriers to entry in its industry, with respect to a company's power vis-a-vis its suppliers, with respect to a company's kind of power / leverage vis-a-vis its buyers or customers, the degree of the threat of substitute products coming in, and then all that what that all implies for kind of the competitive rivalry or the intensity of the competition in a given industry. Okay, let's just do this. Okay, the competitive pressures that result in increased rivalry or that result in an increase in kind of the intensity of the competition, are, here they're 8-fold. I mean, the first, left side, you look at buyer demand declining. There's a debate about about kind of the prospects for the listener market with respect to satellite radio, over-the-air broadcasting, and streaming broadcasting or online broadcasting. Is that market growing? Is that market flat? Or is that market slightly declining? Because there's such a lag between the kind of real-time activity and the generation of data. I mean, you don't get good data on that industry until it's kind of outdated already. So nobody really knows what's going on in the industry, whether it's growing or slightly declining. But we know that if it is growing, it's growing very modestly. In all likelihood, it's probably flat to down a bit. And in industries like that, the level of competition increases dramatically because you've got to work even harder to kind of protect your stake in that business. I mean, you have to work even harder. So it becomes the second factor, it becoming less costly for buyers to switch. A good example of that is the cell phone business. It wasn't that long ago where it was incredibly difficult to get out of contracts with cell phone providers. You couldn't, there was a time not that long ago where you couldn't port your cell phone number. So if you went to a new provider, you had to give up your number. It was just very difficult to get out of that contract. They're not easy to get out even now. I mean, a lot of the contracts are a year to 2, but you do have the ability to get out of your contract now and to switch providers. So in that, in that instance, you end up with what we have in that business today. You end up with pretty fierce, competition, and Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile, and to a lesser extent Walmart, they are fighting tooth and nail for every single customer because it's easier now for the customers to switch. Industry products becoming more alike, or industry products becoming commoditized when it's very difficult to tell one product from another, where there's very little differentiation or less differentiation, that results in increased rivalry. Unused production capacity, we see that in the oil and gas business every day. When oil and gas is plentiful, they kind of compete um, very fiercely when there's a shortage of oil and gas. Prices go way up, and the level of competition declines. Um, you can see the other factors on this page. Diversity of competitors is increasing, and I think a good example of that, once again, is broadcast radio. Where it was traditional radio, they kind of had a monopoly, and it was deemed a great business that would be great forever. And then next thing you know, you've got two satellite radio providers that enter the market in Sirius and XM, and even still, then the over-the-air broadcasting business was great because Sirius and XM were solely focused on killing each other, like, solely focused on driving each other out of business. I mean, they did incredibly irrational things just to drive the other out of the business. So much so that those two were forced to enter into a merger in order to survive. But now the combined company is much stronger, and you also have some substitute products with Pandora, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple, Beats, and all that stuff. And all of a sudden, the business is not nearly as attractive as it used to be, and the over-the-air, the traditional radio guys are fighting for mere survival. Okay, let's see. The competitive pressures associated with new entrants. Once again, the more attractive a particular market, in all likelihood, all other things being equal, the more potential new entrants that you'll end up with. I mean, people are looking for opportunities to deploy capital in sectors that are growing. So those growing sectors will generally be met with more competition. The strength of barriers to entry, a good example here is restaurants. The barriers to entry are incredibly insignificant. There are a zillion new restaurants that open, kind of every day, a zillion restaurants that close. There are virtually no barriers. You need a little capital, but that's about it. The barriers to entry in the satellite radio business, and not to be confused with kind of the listening business altogether, so I'm not including traditional broadcast radio, I'm not including streaming radio, but if you just look at the satellite radio business, you can't get in. I mean, first of all, it would be next to impossible to get the satellites that you need. They're all spoken for either by Sirius XM or by all these different national governments who use that satellite capacity. There's no excess capacity of satellites, so you can't even get those. And if you could, the cost of having a satellite built and launched into orbit is incredibly high. So the barriers in that particular niche of the broadcasting business are incredibly high, and there's a good chance you won't see another satellite broadcaster in the U.S. ever. You'll see other competitors like Pandora and Spotify, but you won't see another satellite provider. The capabilities and resources of potential entrants. We see, today these, very resource-rich, cash-rich companies like Google, Apple, and Facebook, branching off into, other areas. They all have incredible amounts of, cash available. I think we talked last week. I think Apple had, almost $300 billion of cash on its balance sheet. And those firms are looking aggressively at other areas for growth, and they're expanding into other areas. They're all working on, driverless car initiatives, which I don't completely understand, or at least Google and Apple are. And Facebook's even been talking about it. I don't completely understand that, but they're branching off into other areas. So once you have a, very deep-pocketed firm like Google or Apple come into your market, the dynamics overnight will change dramatically, as you would expect. Entry barriers facing new entrants. and I'll just touch on a couple of these. One of the biggest is economies of scale in production. If you guys wanted to, you decided, you know what, I love automobiles. I love cars. I understand cars. I even know how to, make them. I've been studying and, doing research for a long time, and I know how to make them. So I want to go out and manufacture cars. It would be next to impossible to do that, just given the advantage that the established car companies have from a cost standpoint. You'd have to sell so many cars to get your cost down so that you could compete with those guys, which makes it even that much more impressive what Tesla's done. I mean, starting a new car company is incredibly difficult, but then getting to a to a scale, a level of production in which you can make money is almost unheard of, and given that they've done it, it's incredible. So, that speaks to the incumbents' unique cost advantages, strong brand preferences. It is, excuse me, very difficult to build a brand. And, once you build a brand, it's very difficult to kill a brand. I mean, if you've got a great brand, that goes a long way in the eyes of the consumer. I mean, if you've done a good job at satisfying your customers over a long period of time, that goes just a long way. And so if you're coming in new, it's hard to compete with someone who's got an established brand. We talked about the high capital requirements with respect to the satellite providers, and then building a network of distributors. You can have the greatest idea in the world, but you still have to figure out, how do I get that to the end consumer? Once again, if you decided, I'm going to build cars, you have to figure out, how am I going to get those cars to the end consumer? I mean, we've got a very established retail network for automobiles here in the country, and they all have relationships with the major car manufacturers. So how do and you can't just overnight build a retail network. I mean, just the cost of doing that would be incredibly prohibitive. So capital is always a challenge, and then just distributions is generally a huge challenge for new entrants. And it's probably the thing that stops people more often than not. Those two things is what prevents people more often than not in entering a new sector. Competitive pressures, from the sellers of substitute products, what those sellers face, once again, the ready availability of substitutes, the pricing, quality, and performance of the substitute product relative to the incumbent. I mean, you've got to have a product that's, competes with, or is fairly competitive on a quality scale with the products that's already out there. I mean, you got to give people a reason to buy it. And then once again, the switching costs are huge. You need the switching costs to be very low to get people to move over to your substitute product. Please. The competitive pressure stemming from supplier bargaining power. One of the big issues is number of suppliers. We talked about Starbucks, a week or two ago, and once again, Starbucks has a captive supply of farmers that that kind of farm their beans, and Starbucks is generally their sole client. So from a supply standpoint, Starbucks has all the leverage, because if one of those farmers can't produce, they can move to another, but those farmers can't go anywhere because they only have one client. So the number of suppliers is big. The cost of switching, in that case for Starbucks, I would imagine it's not that expensive for them to, increase production at one farm versus another. So I think the cost for them of switching is very low. And then the ratio to suppliers to buyers. So those are things that impact the kind of the power in the relationship between a company and its suppliers. Likewise, with respect to buyers, once again, the switching costs, how high are the switching costs when they're very low? The level of competition is much higher. The degree to which the products are commoditized, the more commodity-like they are in nature, the higher the level of competition. The number and size of buyers relative to sellers is the kind of flip side of the issue we just talked about with suppliers. And then the buyer price sensitivity due to low profit, size of purchase, and consequences of purchase. So let's apply kind of this analysis to Sirius XM, what you guys have spent some time on and will continue to spend some time on over the next few days. Um, on the kind of Porter 5 scale analysis, and we'll get into more detail on this. With respect to the rivalry, it's a very strong competitive force, particularly with the streaming guys coming on board and getting stronger. Spotify, Pandora, Apple Music. Those are very strong competitors. So that's a strong force, a strong competitive force, meaning that there's intense competition with the rivals. Substitutes. For the same reason, it's a strong force because you've got these streaming online broadcasters that are coming on and challenging, Sirius to a greater degree every day. So that's a strong force. New entrants is a moderate force, and really, with respect to the case, when they think of new entrants, they're thinking more of the satellite providers, not just a broadcast new entrant. So, with respect to just the satellite guys, that's probably even a weak competitive force because no one can start a new satellite business. Customers, it's weak to moderate, and we'll get more into that as we dig in. But the customers in general, if you think of the customers as the consumers, they in one respect they have power because there's so many options. So I could be a Pandora subscriber one day and just decide I want to move over to Spotify, and in 10 minutes I can do that. I can move over to Apple in 10 minutes. I can do that. Having said that, my shift won't move the needle at any of those firms. So unless consumers are moving in mass, that consumer doesn't have any power. The advertising firms are also customers. They have a little more sway because they can move their business kind of across these different mediums. Suppliers is a strong competitive force as well. So let's look at substitutes. Once again, substitutes are a relatively strong competitive force. A growing number of substitutes for listening to traditional AM/FM radio and satellite broadcasts. We've got the use of iPods. People are just downloading, music all over the place. iPods, digital music players, and smartphones. At home, people were listening to music channels provided by, the local cable companies. You have, once again, Pandora, Spotify, Apple, all those, alternative products which people are embracing. You still have kind of the old school CDs, or some people watch DVDs, or hopefully they're not watching while they're driving, but the kids are watching DVDs in the car. And then you can even people will listen to music on their laptop while they're in the car. So there are a number of substitutes to satellite radio. Once again, the buyer switching costs are relatively low. And at this point, consumers are generally familiar and comfortable with the substitutes. So they're comfortable, downloading, a zillion songs on their phone or their iPod. They're comfortable, streaming music from Pandora and Spotify into the car, all that. That wasn't the case, 7 years ago, but it's certainly the case now. With respect to new entrants, once again, I'd say it's a moderate competitive force. It's moderate in that you won't see any new satellite radio entrants. You won't see any new traditional radio stations. That business is landlocked. And so you're not going to see people starting new radio stations tomorrow. What you will continue to see is, radio stations changing hands. That happens a lot where, you know, one operator who's got stations in the Midwest may expand to New York. Um, that's a competitive phenomenon that someone like Sirius has to be interested in, because the guy who buys the new station may come in and compete much harder and much more effectively than the old firm. So you have to pay attention to that, but you're not going to see new radio stations. Once again, there's nobody who can enter the satellite radio space. The streaming providers, and that's why it's moderate. It's not weak, because once again, you do have other people coming in the industry who are thought for this purpose as more as substitute products. And then Sirius is, they're probably more threatened than anyone, because they're, purely subscription based. And so, they feel any losses, any subscriber losses, a lot harder than the other firms who are, also, they either have a mix of subscriptions and advertising, or they're advertising based. So new entrants could hurt these guys more. Customers, once again, is weak to moderate, because you and I could move at a moment's notice, but nobody would notice that we moved at that moment's notice. So we don't have much power in that regard. Advertisers do have bargaining power in that they can shift advertising dollars, and the big advertisers, Procter and Gamble, folks like that, they have, Nike, all the automobile guys, they have huge leverage because they're huge national accounts. So they certainly have a lot of leverage. Suppliers, suppliers is a moderately strong to very strong competitive force. And once again, just so it's clear, the stronger the competitive force, the weaker your competitive position. So as an operator, you want, in a perfect world, all of these competitive forces would be, weak. And a good example of that would be, Google in the search business. Google is by far the dominant provider of, internet searches. Yahoo's challenged them, AOL challenged them at one point. You name it, they've had a bunch of people challenge them, but no one's made any headway whatsoever. And so they continue to dominate that, and in fact, they make the vast majority of their money in the search business. So if you were to look at just Google's search business and do a 5 forces analysis, most of their factors would be weak, because it's such a great business. When you're in a, kind of a dog-eat-dog, white knuckle, just, dogfight of an industry, the forces are going to be stronger. And it suggests you have a weaker competitive position than someone who has a bunch of weak forces. I hope that makes sense. But so for Sirius, the suppliers, it's moderately strong to very strong. It depends who you're talking about. If you're talking about the manufacturers of satellites, I'd say in general there are only a few of those. In general, they might have decent leverage over someone like Sirius, but Sirius has got excess satellite capacity. They're using all of their satellites, but they'll have enough capacity over the next few years that they can just continue to add subscribers to those without having to buy new satellites. So given that, I would tip the scale in Sirius's favor. They've got the leverage kind of right now in that relationship. The providers of music-related content, on the other hand, have the greatest bargaining power and are exercising their influence by negotiating for higher royalties with all of their distributors. So the musicians, the publishers, the writers, they're all pushing back hard for higher royalties, and they're getting them from Sirius. They're getting them from Pandora, they're getting them from Apple, so they're fighting back, and they're kind of exercising their power in that respect. So they have greater power than the broadcasters right now. And then the rights to broadcast major sporting events continues to go up. I mean, at some point maybe it'll flatten out, but the rights for, NFL, baseball, NASCAR, the NBA, the rights have continued to climb steadily at very healthy rates for, a number of years now. And that eats into the profits of firms like Sirius or more so the over-the-air broadcasters who are generally broadcasting the sporting events. So and rivalry is kind of the result of everything. Rivalry is kind of the result of the suppliers analysis, the customers analysis, the new entrants, substitutes. It all kind of rolls into, okay, what are then the competitive dynamics overall for the sector? So rivalry is the result of the other four forces. And with respect to Sirius, the rivalry is a very strong competitive force. And once again, it's because of Pandora, it's because of because of Spotify, it's because of Apple, and it's really a result of them, making a strong push into the automotive dashboard. So whereas a few years ago, the only option in buying a new car was traditional radio or satellite radio. Now cars come with Pandora, they come with Spotify, so they with Apple Music. So and all these guys are putting, and girls are putting, a lot of resources into their technology to try to win this arms race. And so it's not clear who's going to win it, but it is clear that the threat or the risk facing Sirius are substantial, because it's like it's like real estate. You got Boardwalk or Park Place, you're in a great position, but if you're not in the dashboard in a meaningful way, you're going to be left out. So to date, they've been there, but they've got to continue to push and continue to innovate to encourage people to use their subscription business versus using one of the others that may cost a lot less or may not cost anything at all. So SWOT analysis. Once again, SWOT: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's a great, quick and dirty way to analyze any business. I mean, you can draw some pretty valid conclusions using the SWOT analysis on any business. I mean, it applies to any. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're a farm in Indiana or a Tesla Motors. I mean, this tool can be used for anyone. But a SWOT, once again, going back to SiriusXM, strengths: they have a diverse and attractive lineup of channels and programs. They have subscription plans, which I'd say are deemed to be reasonably priced. They have long-standing and strong relationships with the auto companies. They have long-standing and strong relationships with the retailers of satellite radios, so the folks like Best Buy who sell their radios to be used in the home. They have relationships with over 11,000 auto dealers. That is incredibly difficult to replicate. Once again, they've got a fleet of 10 orbiting satellites, which is impossible to replicate. They have strong relationships with the manufacturers of satellite radios. They've got working relationships with the component manufacturers. And then they've got this new capability resulting from the acquisition of Agero to develop a connected vehicle platform and begin delivering connected vehicle services. And this is more of a defensive act for them versus an offensive move. I mean, they're trying to fend off Spotify and Pandora, who have a lot of momentum with respect to the dashboard. So they're trying to develop new technologies, new services to strengthen their position in the dashboard of the new car. And they've, beefed up some other areas like customer service. Weaknesses, they still have a lot of debt. Even though when they merged, they went through a restructuring and they exchanged a lot of their debt for equity, so their balance sheet is stronger today than it ever has been. But they still have a lot of debt. They still have, they every year they're still subsidizing, the hardware manufacturers, the car company. Subsidies are kind of going all over the place to encourage people to try the service. So it still costs a lot to get people to join, even for a trial. Um, Opportunities. The biggest opportunity for them is to expand the percentage of owners of new and used vehicles that subscribe to their service. So once again, if you look at their addressable market, it's all those people that have the service or have the capability to have the service already, that they have the technology in their vehicles, and all you have to do is convince them to give it a shot and turn on the service. So they don't have to do anything but subscribe. So they have a huge addressable market that they can go after every day. So that's a big opportunity. Once again, they, delivering more connected services, dashboard-related services to car makers is a huge opportunity. A lot of people vying for that. And then expansion outside the U.S. is a big opportunity. And, outside the U.S., there, in general, not many places are as technologically, advanced as we are. So someone like a Sirius can make hay there, because it'll be years before they'll have, be faced with all the competition that they're faced with here in the state. So that could be a big opportunity. Threats, the connected car technology. Is Sirius going to be the, Sirius XM, are they going to be the winner in this arms race? Is, Pandora going to be the winner? Is, Spotify going to be the winner? I think that's yet to be determined. And then you've got, you still, they're faced with the threat of, people just turning off the service and opting for, local radio or streaming services. Unlimited data plans, is a threat. I mean, that, Verizon's pushing it, AT&T's pushing it. I don't know exactly how popular they've been relative to the whole cell phone market, but, if you assume that, one day, a lot of people, half the market or even, 40% of the market has unlimited data plans, then they're, that would encourage them to use their smartphones for more things like, music and sports and the like. One thing today that prevents them from doing that is the cost of data. So that, someone may keep, Sirius XM because it would cost them so much more to stream stuff to their phones. But if that changes, that could be a negative game changer for Sirius XM. Constructing a strategic group map. We talked about this a little bit last week. But effectively, you want to identify the competitive characteristics that differentiate firms in a given industry. Then you want to plot a map with, generally two variables to try to, separate the firms in a given industry. You want to then, assign firms, plots or spaces on that map. And then you draw circles around each strategic group, proportionate to, either sales or proportionate to, audience size or whatever it is you're trying to use to differentiate the firms in that business. But the typical variables used include, price, quality. You'll see that a lot. Going from high, medium to low, you'll have price on one, on one axis and quality on the other. You have geographic coverage. Are you a local operator? You have a regional business, national, or even global. Product line breadth. Is it you have a wide product line versus a narrow product line, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some distribution channels. How do you sell your product? Those are some of the key variables used to generate a map. And then why do firms use these maps? Well, they're beneficial for determining a company's market positioning relative to other competitors. And we already talked about that. So, revisiting once again, we looked at this retail example, and you'll see once again this. I think the circles are based on revenues here. So you see that Walmart and Kmart are much larger in scale or in scope than the other competitors, and I think you should really separate the two because clearly Walmart is light years larger than Kmart now. And then as you move kind of up the map in terms of higher prices, higher quality, you get some smaller operators, Kohl's, Gap, Polo, Ralph Lauren. So how would someone use this? If you're, Banana Republic, for example, you say, okay, we're kind of a middle of the road operator with respect to geographic coverage, with respect to price and quality. Is that where we want to be? Or do we want to kind of change our whole paradigm? Do we want to, move upscale, charge much higher prices? Do we want to, kind of go down in market and go for volume, selling more volume at cheaper prices? Do we want to expand our geographic coverage, from kind of middle of the road, average number of locations to many locations? Another good example is at the top you see Gucci. I remember back in, gosh, it's probably 20 years ago, Gucci was, almost out of business. I mean, they had really kind of lost their way, and their products they weren't selling at all, and the products ended up in a lot of, places like, Marshalls and TJ Maxx, places where they hadn't traditionally sold their product, but the products weren't selling, through their traditional channels, so through Saks and Neiman's, and so they found themselves, the products found themselves being discounted and sold through, some non-traditional channels, at least for Gucci. And they had a decision to make. They, competitively, they weren't making money. They were losing money because it cost them more to make their products, given the materials that they were using, et cetera, than they were making and selling them, at these, heavily discounted prices. And they had to decide, strategically, what are we going to do in order to survive? And they ended up, cutting back on the number of SKUs, the number of products offered, and they took all their products completely out of the discount channel. They set up these arrangements with Neiman's and Saks and Nordstrom that, we'll take back any product that you can't sell, but the last thing we want to do is to, have our products, find their way into the discount channel. And what happened is their sales, in the near term actually, contracted a bit because they were selling a lot of product through the discount channel, so their sales went down, but their profits went sky high because they wouldn't compromise anymore on pricing, and they were getting full prices on everything. So even though they're selling less, they were getting full prices, then they were making a healthy margin on everything that they were selling. So in the course of 2 years, they kind of righted themselves, and they ended up, they were still private at the time. They ended up going public through an IPO, huge valuation. The business, has been, very successful since then. Strategic group map for in-vehicle entertainment, you could use a lot of different variables, but one that we're using here, on the kind of left axis, you've got the breadth of, program offerings from a narrow, limited format to a very broad, big variety of topics and programs being covered. So satellite clearly is broad. They've got so many channels. They've got so many different genres that they provide. They've got, they've got music, any kind of music you can think of. They got sports, they got politics, so that they're extremely broad. The local radio stations, on the other hand, are generally very narrow. They do what they do. They generally offer one genre. It's R&B. It's hip hop. It's pop. It's news. I mean, it's one genre. Um, they are generally they've got this huge bubble, and the bubbles here are based on audience sizes, but the local radio stations, the bubble's huge because that's all the stations combined. So they've got tremendous coverage kind of across the country, but relative to some of the other guys. Then you kind of along the axis on the bottom, the method of entertainment service delivery. Once again, so you got local, you got Sirius, who's the only satellite provider now. Then you've got the internet streaming providers, who, with respect to breadth, they're probably closer to Sirius than they are to the local stations, but they're not nearly as broad as Sirius. And then you've got in-vehicle devices. So you've got your iPod, your phone, whatever you download, music to. So Sirius would use this and to try to decide or answer the question of what they want to be. Do we is this where we want to be? And I would venture to guess they would answer yes. I mean, our kind of niche is providing a broad variety of topics and programming, and that's the only way we can compete is to continue to provide top-notch programming on a host of different topics to appeal to a large swath of the population, and so I think that's how they would that's what they conclude from that map. Overall, we like Sirius's strategic position on the map. Once again, they are the monopoly provider of satellite entertainment. It's very easy for their customers, subscribers, to have access to a variety of channels, even while driving. It's very easy to navigate. Pandora and/or any other streamer, you generally don't navigate. You just put it on and plays whatever it plays, but it's hard to manipulate while driving. They're well positioned to gain additional subscribers as the more and more used cars that come to market that already have the equipment installed. So now that they've we've kind of run this whole cycle, the used cars that are hitting the market already have the equipment installed, and they've got so Sirius has a large installed base of customers that they can market to. Look, you've got the product. All we have to do is turn the service on, and you're in business. So that makes life for them, a lot easier than it would otherwise be. And then they've got, they have once again, they've got, a broader product offering. So a much broader product offering than, even Pandora and someone like Spotify. So, so they're well positioned to compete. The subscription fees are an issue. So we'll see kind of how that plays out over time. Key success factors. Let's look at Sirius. Appealing programming. They will, I think they will continue to do fairly well to the extent they can continue to provide programming that will encourage people to continue to subscribe to the service. Once they get to a point where the programming is stale, it's dated, it's not interesting to people, people will leave that service in droves. The partnerships they have clearly with the automotive manufacturers, with the automotive dealer, is a huge key success factor. They can't survive without the support of the dealers. They can't survive without the support of the auto manufacturers. They have a variety of plans, which helps because they can try to meet the customer where he or she is. They've got a plan almost for everybody. And then the whole, the connected car, the services, the technology aspect, that will be a key success factor. How well can they compete with Pandora, Apple, Spotify going forward and maintaining their position or improving their position in the dashboard. Um, the traditional radio stations, because key success factors are appealing, generating appealing program that can attract a sizable listening audience that would be attractive to advertisers. And then they can sell ads to those advertisers at, attractive pricing. Yeah, it's pure and simple. The streaming folks, once again, appealing programming that can attract a large and, loyal following. They can charge, attractive listening, subscription fees, but also can sell, advertising at a decent price to cover their costs, and, particularly their programming costs. Competitive strength assessment. You want to make, in order to generate a competitive strength assessment, it's just another tool to try to assess a company's kind of positioning in a given industry. You make a list of key success factors and measures. Generally they're 6 to 10 key success factors. So you're not going to list everything. You're going to list the most relevant key success factors. You assign a weight to each strength based on its perceived importance. So you list the key success factors kind of in order of priority, and then you assign a weight to each one. And then you rate the firm and its rivals on each measure and multiply each to get an overall weight. So let's take a look. So, and once again, the importance weight, it adds up to 1. So, 100% or 1. So here, I don't even know what company this is, but they've got a list of 10 or so key success factors. Their biggest success factor is the relative cost position, their cost position versus their competitors. They listed that as 30% of kind of the overall, the sum of the important weights, so that's huge. Some of their other important success factors include, quality / product performance, reputations, big, manufacturing capabilities, big, customer service capabilities, big, and then some of the other factors are, important but less important. And then a company will look at kind of its strength on a scale of 1 to 10 relative to a couple of rivals. So here, the company that's doing the analysis is ABC Co. And once again, the biggest factor or the biggest determinant of success in this business is relative cost position. They gave that a weight of 30%. And they say that they're on that scale, they are a 5. Their rival number 1 is a 10, and the rival number 2 is a 1. So how would you use a representative competitive strength assessment? Once you determine that your relative cost position is kind of 30% of the overall weighting, that's by far the largest, most important key success factor. You got to figure out a way to get from 5 to 8 or 9. It's going to be impossible for you as a 5 to compete with someone who's a 10 on a factor that's 30% of the overall kind of key success factor weighting. I hope that makes sense, but it's just so important. It's 3 times more important than quality / product performance, 30% versus 10%. Is 6 times more important in this business than dealer network distribution capability. So it's 30% versus 5%. In order to compete effectively in this business, you've got to figure out as ABC Co how to get your costs in line and to be more competitive on the cost side with rival 1. Rival 2, they're going out of business. I mean, they're a 1. Their costs are way out of whack. There's no way they probably can't get to a point where they compete with rival 1. So you multiply your importance weight by the strength you provide, and then the strength rating is completely objective. So that's in order for this to be helpful, you've got to be perfectly honest. And you know, I think it's safe to conclude here that ABC Co was probably pretty honest. They said that relative cost position is incredibly important, and we don't rate very well on that scale. So I think it's safe to conclude that they were honest. Some companies do this, and they don't want to know the truth, and they kind of artificially, kind of ramp up their strength rating, and they come up with an answer that their overall competitive positioning is much better than everybody else's. But if you're doing it honestly, you can get some really meaningful feedback from this. So hope that makes sense. So you multiply the importance weighting by your relative strength to come up with a weighted score. So here on the top line, 10% times 8 is 0.8. You go on that all the way down, and then you add up those numbers to come up with your overall weighted competitive strength rating. And once again, we already knew that Rival 1 was probably going to have a higher relative strength rating than us because, once again, on the most important factor, they have, a much higher strength rating than we have. So we knew that in all likelihood we would, they would be superior to us. And then the question coming out is, okay, how can we once again get our costs in line and get to an 8 or 9 so that we can compete effectively with Rival 1? Identification of key success factors, what product attributes and service features affect the buying decision. You look at resources and competitive capabilities, and then what shortcomings you have that might put you at a disadvantage. Key success factors. Let's look at Sirius. Appealing programming. I think they will continue to do fairly well to the extent they can continue to provide programming that will encourage people to continue to subscribe to the service. Once they get to a point where the programming is stale, it's dated, it's not interesting to people, people will leave that service in droves. The partnerships they have clearly with the automotive manufacturers, with the automotive dealer is a huge key success factor. They can't survive without the support of the dealers. They can't survive without the support of the auto manufacturers. They have a variety of plans, which helps because they can try to meet the customer where he or she is. They've got a plan almost for everybody. And then the whole, the connected car, the services, the technology aspect, that will be a key success factor. How well can they compete with Pandora, Apple, Spotify going forward and maintaining their position or improving their position in the dashboard. The traditional radio stations, key success factors are appealing, generating appealing program that can attract a sizable listening audience that would be attractive to advertisers. And then they can sell ads to those advertisers at, attractive pricing. Yeah, it's pure and simple. The streaming folks, once again, appealing programming that can attract a large and, loyal following. They can charge, attractive listening, subscription fees, but also can sell, advertising at a decent price to cover their costs, and, particularly their programming costs. Indicators of strategic success. I think a lot of these are pretty straightforward. What's evidencing success in our business? What evidence do we have that, we're doing the right things? Well, generally, you hope that will lead to sales growth, increased market share. You hope that it will lead to the acquisition and retention of customers, which is particularly important for someone like SiriusXM. You would expect, if you're doing a great job, that you will see, increasing profit margins, that you will see growing financial strength, growing your cash balances, you're paying off debt. You have a, positive reception in the equity markets. People are buying your stock, driving up the stock price, et cetera, et cetera. So indicators of strategic success. So let's take a look at Sirius. I think, I've kind of, my point this evening was that, they've done some good things. They've built a pretty nice business. They've got a very fierce competitive force ahead of them, a fierce competitive field ahead of them, but they're doing a lot of really good things. So let's see if the numbers actually bear out that they're doing a lot of good things. Um, these are all a percentage of revenue. So I'm just going to focus on the things that I circled here. But you look at their program and content expenses as a percent of total revenue, it went from 10.9% in 2010 to 7.6% in 2013. That's a huge decline. So they're doing a great job of, I would say, of controlling their programming and content expenses, because in general they're paying more for content, as I mentioned earlier, but they're adding subscribers at a healthy rate, so they're growing revenues at a faster clip than they're experiencing increased programming and content expenses. So 10.9 to 7.6, that is a big drop, and that's incredibly impressive. Customer service and billing expenses, once again, 10.4 to 8.4, that is a big drop. I mean, 2 percentage points, for a kind of mature, large business is dramatic. So that's a big drop. They're doing a great job there. They're, doing a good job managing their satellite transmission expenses. The cost of equipment as a percent of total revenues is going down. Their subscriber acquisition costs are going down from 14.7 to 13%. That's a huge drop. I mean, these big companies, these type of shifts, it's like turning the, Titanic. It's hard to make a dent in some of their expenses, but these folks have done a really good job of rationalizing their expenses. Even though subscriber acquisition costs are still very high, 13% of revenue. So as I mentioned, it costs a lot of money for them to add each new customer, because they're subsidizing, once again, the auto companies. They're giving everybody incentives to go out and market their product. They're paying people to do that, and it costs a lot of money. Their general and administrative expenses, 8.6 to 6.9, that's incredibly attractive. So as a result of Sirius XM rationalizing their costs, lowering their costs as a percentage of revenue, their operating profit margin went from 16.5%, which is decent on its own, to 27.5%. You don't see that kind of jump. I mean, that is incredible. And a lot of this is, it's the company doing a great job after the merger between Sirius and XM and reducing a lot of redundant costs. So this is a lot of this is the result of that, but they've done a phenomenal job. You take your operating profit margin from 16.5% of revenue to 27.5% of revenue. You don't see that very often. So yeah, so they've done a fantastic job.